Welcome to the Inspire Health Podcast. Your life is about to get a whole lot better. Have you ever felt like you tried everything and yet still couldn't find the answers or the solutions that you were seeking? Whether you're dealing with chronic illness, physical or emotional pain, I want you to know that your body is the most sophisticated machine on planet Earth. Your body holds unfathomable wisdom. Trust in it and learn from it. Know that there are answers and there are solutions to your specific health challenges. And we will be uncovering all of them here on the Inspire Health Podcast. I'm so excited to be a part of your healing journey. Your transformation starts now. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Inspire Health Podcast. Today, I have with us Scott Davis. Scott has been sharing his passion for health as a movement therapist, yoga teacher, doctor of traditional Chinese medicine, and health educator for the past 2 decades. In his teaching, he integrates therapeutic traditions, contemporary approaches to health, and the latest research in biomechanics and human movement in ways that are clear, accessible, and results-based. Scott brings a balance of authenticity, humor, and depth to his teaching, a synthesis of yoga and Eastern medicine, and what he calls the 3 pillars of health: movement, nutrition, and rest. In 2005, he founded one of the most renowned schools of yoga in Canada, where he trained and mentored hundreds of yoga teachers and movement instructors for 13 years. Scott is passionate about learning and is deeply committed to helping people grow and feel better in their lives. Scott, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I am excited to talk to you about a whole bunch of stuff. You've got a really eclectic background as well. So not just a yoga instructor, but a movement therapist and a doctor of traditional Chinese medicine. So can you tell me, just start off, how did you even end up in this whole world, and what came first? Yoga, Chinese medicine? How did it all evolve?
Yeah, I've been able to channel my ADD really well. So it's through all my interests. I started out, I was lucky I had parents who introduced me to yoga and meditation as a kid. So I was kind of this live wire full of energy, and it was really hard to get me focused on things when I was younger. And so my parents were into yoga and into meditation. So me and my sister would sit and do meditation classes once a week with their teacher. And so that kind of exposed me to this work early on. And then I came back to it again as a teenager, and eventually ended up really getting into yoga around 16. I got a copy of the Illustrated Guide to Yoga, Swami Shivananda's book, and just started flipping through and doing all the kriyas and all the asanas, and I was really fascinated with it. So at that point, I thought, I'm going to just go right to the source. So I went to India. Right, I finished high school, went to India, and spent about 6 months there, just looking around and really trying to figure out what yoga was all about and find teachers. And I studied with different traditions, and that was like my first exposure actually to acupuncture and Eastern medicine through that trip. So I'd never really seen much. I hadn't been exposed to much other than Western medicine in my kind of exposure to healthcare growing up, and that really opened my eyes, like when I was in the East and in China and in India. And so that basically came back and was at that point really into yoga and doing yoga more and more and more as a practice. And I was interested in studying medicine, but I think I had these 2 parts of my mind. Like one part was just conditioned by what I had grown up with, and another part that was permanently changed by the experience of traveling to India and China. And so I kind of pursued I did pre-med at McGill for a couple of years, and then realized, wow, that something just doesn't feel right. I'm like on the wrong track. So that's when I pursued traditional Chinese medicine, and I've been practicing for the last 20 years. So it was kind of like in tandem in a way, and it's still it still has followed that kind of tandem path, because I feel like even though they're separate traditions, they feed off each other so beautifully.
Mhm.
And I've been kind of like weaving them together in my own practice and my own teaching ever since.
Nice. That's pretty amazing that you were doing meditation as a kid. I mean, even back then, I mean, meditation's kind of, you know, in vogue right now, but it's like back then
Mhm.
that would have been really on the outskirts. So
Yeah, they were kind of new age hippies. They came over from England in the early 70s, and they came from more of a traditional background, but they were really looking into these spiritual practices, and they got deeply into a group called Agni Yoga, and they exposed my sister and I to this practice. And it was sort of my first taste of a yoga community as a kid. So I think I kind of it was in it was those were like the early exposure, and I tried to seek it out ever since. Yeah.
that's awesome though. What a great starting point, and really what a nice gift for your parents to be able to set you up with from early on.
Hmm.
Gosh, I think
Yeah, I feel pretty lucky.
I think if I mean we're trying to bring mindfulness into schools now, right?
Hmm.
So just because of all the benefits with it. So yeah, what a wonderful gift your parents were able to give you such an early on.
Hmm.
I had a similar sort of story with that a little bit, and how I ended up even getting into naturopathic medicine. I did martial arts from early on, and through doing martial arts, you get exposed to meditation and movement and breath and a lot of these different things. And right after high school, I went and lived in Japan for several months and trained there, and
Okay.
sort of became immersed in that culture a little bit, and went to school, University of Victoria, did pre-med. And as I was doing that, same thing, hit a point where it was like, that just didn't quite fit the what at least what resonated with my concept of it. Nothing wrong with it, just wasn't the right fit for me. and
Hmm.
and then kind of, even, I mean, going through school, you don't really have your career counselors telling you too much about going into being a doctor of Chinese medicine or even a doctor of naturopathic medicine. It's just not on the list. So when I
Yeah.
finally came across it, that there was such a thing, it was like, oh wow, like,
Hmm.
where was this, and
Yeah.
then sort of a really nice marriage. Now,
Yeah, that's super cool.
you were saying that when you were in India, you were basically moving around and starting to even think about, what yoga really is all about. So
Hmm.
from that point to decades later, has that changed for you? What is yoga to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, at the time, my exposure, as an 18-year-old traveling through India it was all novel. It all felt very new, and I thought that I was going to find yoga on every corner. But what I realized very quickly is that what I understood as like the physical postures were just something that people would refer to as exercise. And then if you wanted to study yoga, that you would really have to find a teacher. And that was not something that was so easy to find. In fact, short of like, I found a couple of ashrams that I ended up staying at in the north, and then ended up in Mysore in the south, where I got into Ashtanga yoga, and that was like pretty heavy on the asana side. But other than that, it was mostly, a spiritual practice where you would study with a teacher. You would really commit your time to, the lifestyle of, wasn't just the asanas. So I would say like the exposure to it back then was, I kind of understand it at this time, that what I thought was yoga to them was really just physical exercise that they would be teaching in schools. I would ask people, I want to learn yoga, and I demonstrate a pose, and they're like, oh, that triangle pose, like we do that in gym class. It wasn't like I was looking for, just what we would find now, like a yoga school that was teaching, but it was more like you would learn meditation, you would practice service, you would volunteer, you would take part in the community. And so I think that is very different from how we practice it here, um, and but that was eye opening for me, you know.
Hmm.
Um,
That's really interesting though. So it'd be neat if when people even join a yoga studio here in the
mhm,
West,
mhm.
if it was explained a little bit more even. I mean, I know sometimes the teachers weave that into their practice, but it would be neat if when people signed up for it, there was a bit of a breakdown that here's sort of what yoga is outside of just the physicality part of it. There's an act of service with it. There's, that would be, because that's in a lot of ways, that's where I think the most of the richness really sits in the tradition.
100%. You know, what was interesting to me on that first trip to India, I was reading Carl Jung's book Psychology in the East, and it was all about his time in the later part of his years where he became interested in mysticism and in yoga. And one of the things he says in the book is that as Westerners, and I still think this is very true, as Westerners, we need to find our own yoga. So, just taking the practices, that originated in the East and then bringing it back to the West. I think that's where we've seen, like, as you say, some disconnect, like the fact that there isn't that understanding of a bigger practice beyond just the physical postures.
Well, and that's a big part that I think you've worked with a lot in your studio over the years, and the work that you've done in retreats and whatnot. You do a lot of work around how do you bridging this ancient practice and integrate it into a modern lifestyle, because the reality is you don't live out at an ashram somewhere. So how do you make it applicable to your life living here in North America? So what
Yeah.
does that look like? How do you even start that process, and what have you found?
Well, I think that what I've realized is that there's certain things that constitute a practice, and that, at the end of the day, the practice is something that is a ritual that needs to be adapted to each person. So another thing that is really kind of a bit of a disconnect that I think has amplified in the West is this idea that yoga is taught in a big group setting. There's a lot of advantages to that because it builds community and it creates this incredible, like, shared experience. At the same time, I think a practice can be really anything that serves each individual. So, um, to me, really adapting yoga to more of a modern integration has to do with seeing what practice is going to best serve that person, and sometimes you have to be creative. So one of the great things about doing a retreat, or doing an experience that's beyond just a short class, like some kind of educational experience, is that the community becomes the teacher, and then each person is sharing their own um, storehouse of wisdom of things that they've found that have been super useful for them. So rather than this kind of top down education, which I found to be less valuable than everyone sitting around and sharing best practices and things that have worked for them. And then at the end of the day, we come home, say after a weekend or a day long or a week or a month or whatever it is, we come home immersed in this shared experience, inspired to create our own practice. Because a practice can be so many things. Like, we know it's really three things. One is it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what you put in that middle is really so individual. Like, like you say with martial arts, like, there's practices in different martial arts where that kind of bridge gaps more towards a yoga tradition, where it's more forms that you're doing by yourself, like tai chi or qigong, very similar to yoga practice, and same thing, like, depending on what your needs are, That there's a saying in yoga they say tantra equals dharma, which means your practice is determined by your path, by you. So it's that kind of unique element that determines what you need to be practicing. And sometimes when I present this idea to people, they get a little like uncomfortable. They're like, because people like form and they like structure. And so, yeah, we have structures. I came from a very rigid practice of Ashtanga yoga where there's, 6 series and you're doing the same, poses every day, and you start to feel like it's a set combination of postures. And, what I realized over time is that not only is that practice not necessarily suitable for everybody, but it isn't a set combination lock. It's not like you're unlocking some special thing. You're actually just committing to something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you're engaging in these practices that build a deeper connection to yourself, and to your breath, to your posture, to your thoughts, and the connection between all of those three. So I think a practice can be so many things. And I feel like that's how we really go forward with making these practices less, like demystifying them for people. That, as long as you create a container and it becomes this kind of sacred thing by giving it a special place in your day, that ritual can really consist of so many different practices. And those practices, when we really look at it, we can say, well, what are the practices that are going to serve me the most in my life?
Mm-hmm. Which are completely individual, that a lot of times you don't even know until you've started the practice to then get the awareness and the aha moments that reflect that back to you.
100%. I think that's, for me, how my practice has changed and evolved over the years, going from having a very, very hyper physical practice of Ashtanga yoga where I would practice for 2, sometimes 3 hours and really physically demanding postures, to then having small kids where I would go to do the practice and I would just feel so physically exhausted from not having slept the night before, or like just being so taxed that the practice actually, the design of the practice had to change as a result of the needs that changed. So that was where I got into restorative yoga, and that was 17 years ago. That's now a huge part of my life, is the practice of rest, like really learning to rest and embodying that place of rest even when you haven't slept, and really finding how can we keep the practice alive, as our needs shift, as the demands shift, as life shifts around us. That the constant is this kind of this the presence of this space, this physical time and space that you're committed to, but what's in that space can be really quite creative.
Yeah, I love that perspective on it. It makes me think about lots of different things where I'll have conversations with people about like diet or
Mm-hmm.
exercise. It's sometimes people are on a diet for a long time, and it's almost like what can sometimes happen is if you stay on it and become so habitual, and maybe it was working really well for a period of time, and now all of a sudden it's maybe not working as well as it used to, but it's easy to get stuck in the concept that I need to keep doing it because I've just been doing it all the time, rather than
Yeah.
needs. And maybe when you, prior to being perimenopausal, something that you were doing for exercise and diet worked really well, and now that you're in a different area of your life, maybe that needs to be something totally different, and it's completely okay to change it around. But to have the awareness of what are you feeling, what's coming up, and then from there make different choices around it.
Mm-hmm. Totally. And in a way, I feel like that part, like you touched on, needs to be, that's kind of how I start every practice. And I think that's where, at the heart of it, yoga and meditation are really one practice. We like to separate them, as now I'm doing my
Mhm.
meditation sit, and now I'm doing my yoga, and there's value to separating and parsing out these practices. But for me, the meditation practice is how I begin like my yoga practice, so that I can really attune myself to what is actually happening, rather than imposing my own beliefs on what I think I should be doing.
Yeah.
So that's sometimes a difficult practice, because it means being able to pivot and being able to shift, and realizing when something, maybe as you said, is like run its course, maybe it's not appropriate anymore. Yeah, beliefs are so powerful, and I think in a way, sometimes the power of the yoga practice, or one of the values of the yoga practice, is for us to really be able to look closely and question, like, is this serving me? Is it something that would be useful to keep continuing? Is it something that I need at this time, or is it just something that's feeding my ego or my sense of what I believe, or
Hmm.
all of the above?
Yeah, exactly. When when you're looking at yoga, did it start more as a physical practice and then move to a spiritual practice? Is it more one than the other, or is it really a marriage of all of that together?
Well, the beauty of it is a great question. The beauty of it is that you can start yoga as a purely physical practice, and I encourage people to just start where they are. I think that's sort of I think the best place to start any practice is just start wherever you are. There's people ask, like, when's the best time to start a yoga practice? And it's like, now. It's really the best time. And
And probably if
a
you're
moment from
asking,
now, yeah,
yeah, it's like
exactly.
if you're asking, you're probably ready.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of like my friend Michael Stone used to say, it's like, where he would use the analogy of, like, where do we enter the river? And you could enter a river at any point. You could go to the source. You could just enter at any point, because it's this flowing thing. So I feel like you can enter the practice through any part, which could look like a purely physical practice, where someone, I get a lot of people who are like athletes. They're stiff from their sport, and they have repetitive stress on their joints, or people who are desk jockeys and they don't move at all, and they need to move. And so the physical side of it is such an awesome entry point. But what you really quickly start to realize is, the more that you are committed to a practice, is that you actually are the whole part of you, all of you is engaged in that practice. So it's just which part, it's kind of like, which facet are you focusing on? So as you're doing this physical practice, purely physical practice, people start to give reports about, oh, wow, my concentration is improving. I feel less stressed. I feel less reactive. I feel like this deeper sense of a presence of some kind outside of myself. Maybe they have already a religious faith that they feel more connected to, and I think that's so awesome. What I feel is happening is that we're just engaging more with present moment reality. Entry point might be the physical body, but for me at this point, like, a movement practice, a physical practice, is a spiritual practice for me. Like, I don't really see so much of a difference. And I think you could make the same kind of comparison if, let's say, you wanted to engage in a spiritual practice, a purely spiritual practice, that you enter from that point, and very soon you realize, I have a body. I have this body that needs to be taken care of.
Hmm.
And if I get this a lot with meditation. Like, I do a retreat once a year with my friend Jeff Warren, and he has this community of meditation a large community of meditation of meditators. And it's what meditators often need most is to move. That's the irony of it, because they've been doing that practice so much that to bring greater balance to their already established practice, they need to move. They need to do more of the asanas. They need to engage in movement in their bodies. And I would say the same is true for people who practice primarily physically based yoga. Like they have a very strong asana practice, and they have a whole list of things. Every time they roll out their mat, they need to stretch every single part of their bodies. That I found over the years, mostly what those people end up benefiting the most from is learning to sit still and learning to watch their minds and learning to connect to a deeper level behind the physical agitations that never end. This kind of whatever the urge is to be obsessed with the potential physicality of a yoga practice, because it can never end. You can just keep on stretching. You can keep on exploring and deepening these postures to an infinite level, that I think at some point you have to be able to see that actually the purpose of this physical practice is to make my body more stable so that I can feel more connected with my spirit. Otherwise you're just dysregulated, like literally dysregulated. So it's to use the body in a way as a way to connect to these deeper parts of ourselves is that's one way I look at it.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense too, even when you look at how the body is really how the body is constructed. So from your perspective as a Chinese medicine doctor, doing the postures are going to facilitate movement of qi through different meridian patterns. All the myofascial chains relate to different meridians, and that's a whole different piece. So even if you're just thinking about doing the physicality, sort of unconsciously, you're still moving energy in different channels from almost like a vital body level of health, right? So without even
100%.
being aware of it, you're doing other things when you are moving your body, right? And that's sometimes why you see these people in practice, and all of a sudden, they get emotional or something might kind of, they're like, what the hell's going on? And it hits them by surprise, because sometimes that stuff is just through the process of movement, you're opening up stuff that you weren't really aware of.
100%. The energy is stored within the body, and it gets, through our life experience, through our reaction to our environment, we tighten up, we create these coagulations, tensions in the body that form blockages, as you say, in the energy channels, and these can dictate our health. I found that just simply by learning to release these blockages through a regular practice, that we have so much access to this wellspring of energy. Like people who are tired, it's often, I found, just through, there can be other deficiencies or other areas nutritionally or that need to be supplemented, but I found just through moving and kind of clearing blocked energy and opening up the flow of the breath and the body, that it's amazing that people who have fatigue, how they benefit from just letting go of those the way that we tighten up, and we it's so natural to block our energy.
Well, and you, I think, do a lot of incorporating you bridge yoga with other movement therapies and stuff too. So
Mm-hmm.
what have you found to be most valuable? What types and why did you start to feel that bridging some of the different movements was adding another layer of benefit for people?
Yeah, I think it's more through observation, like observation of my own body and what was happening. Like a lot of these things become clear over many years. What we think is like an ancient practice might just be, a few decades old, like where a lot, like one of the things I started seeing like about 15-year mark in my practice, and I would ask my teachers about it, but I was starting to see joint instabilities, for example, like in my SI joints or in my hips and my shoulders. I started getting really loose joints, and to the point where like my shoulder was like partially dislocating every time I would do certain moves, and anytime I did stuff outside of like my formal yoga practice. And I got kind of concerned about it, so I asked a couple of my colleagues and teachers at the time, and the response that I got was that they didn't really do much else outside of outside of yoga. So I think it depends on who you are. And for me, I like to be able to play with my kids and, just feel that, I think for me, the bigger picture is a practice for health, and so my inquiry about like what is a sustainable long-term practice and what does it look like to be, the healthiest version of yourself. So that was kind of like the guiding question for me. And I felt like yoga has been such an integral part of that. But at a certain point, I would say like 15, 20 years in, I needed to start adding in more variability in the movements, because like, as we know, anything we do for a long period of time repetitively, it becomes a form of stress and repetitive stress. So I think at this point, I feel better than, like, I'm 43 years old and I feel better than I ever have. Like, I don't have some of the flexibility that I had when I was doing strictly end range kind of yoga postures. But I feel like, I guess my practice now revolves around play and variability and really understanding the process, I guess, from the point of view of neuroscience would be like, how do we become more neuroplastic? Like, how do we expand our capacity for greater resilience in the body, in the mind, that we can, build up a storehouse, a capacity to be more fully engaged in life. And I think sometimes what I noticed in, let's call it like an end range asana practice, was the kind of the practice that I was engaged in, where you would try to stretch your ligaments and your joints to the absolute nth degree, and it looks great on Yoga Journal. Like, I was in Yoga Journal, like, it looks good. You can create these fancy postures, pretzel like positions, but I would question, like, really, is that mechanically useful for your body in the long term? And for me, I found that the more that I engage in those practices, those end range practices, I became more and more unstable. So for me, it was about understanding the biomechanics of it, understanding the neuroscience of what you're doing when you deform your tissue to that degree, and whether there is kind of a middle ground, and how yoga postures can be incorporated into other types of movement. Like, what I've come to is that through not using yoga to push the nth degree of our range of motion, that actually yoga becomes an integral part of the pendulation piece, being able to be in a playful, ready state in the body, where the body is capable of various types of movement, static movement, and also more dynamic movements like dance or martial arts, or more kinetic, quicker movements that don't always translate so well from a static yoga pose to a more dynamic movement, but also the pendulation of that to deep rest states. And I think where yoga really has so much a wealth of knowledge is really learning beyond sleep, learning how to rest deeply. And seeing where we're holding tension where we don't need to be holding tension, and is that an efficient and an economical movement? Are we just subconsciously walking around when we don't need to be gripping our jaw or gripping our hips? And I think yoga is really amazing for that, where it teaches us how to access deep rest and a feeling of ease in the body, so that our movements are more fluid, and any way that we choose to move, which I'm just, my approach now is I'm just so excited by all ways of moving. And I think that came through uh, um, a long time of practicing yoga in a specific way, getting to us literally to the end of the line of my joints, and then
Mhm.
realizing I need to develop some recoil. I need to develop some capacity um, literally bounce back and to have more resilience in my tissues on a physical level, and emotionally and mentally. That just opened up the movement space into this playground.
Mhm.
So I feel really excited about movement now.
Well, it makes it fun too. So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, well, two things. It's refocusing on asking yourself if what you're doing is actually functional for the body anymore.
Mm-hmm.
No different than someone going to the gym all the time and getting huge muscles, but they're not able to, put their arms above their head or something. So
Exactly.
again, it's like, are you doing it for just the look of it, which might be fine to do for a period of time too, but if you're really trying to look for longevity in a practice of any practice, see if it's still functional. Can you still move and do the things you'd like to do? Does it open up your life to be a little bit bigger, or is it actually creating a little bit more restrictions on it? I know my wife
Yeah.
found the same sort of issues with her joints. She's extremely flexible, and she did a lot of practice that really took you into some pretty deep stretches. And she kind of found that then the opposite was what she needed. She actually needed to focus more on building a little more strength and
Mm,
steadying her joints as opposed to almost sinking into the joints. So,
100%.
and when you mentioned play, play is such a beautiful thing because it's such a wonderful nurturing ground for building new neural networks to
Mhm.
in a fun way that engages and allows you to explore. Right, there's an openness with play that lets you just explore, and then you can start to build some of these different neural networks and these neuroplasticity that we were talking about.
Yeah. And I think it's totally to your point. Like, it's when you engage in this idea of play, it becomes more about, okay, well, in yoga, it's the state of you're doing it alone. You might be within a group of doing similar things together, but you're on your sticky mat and you're doing this kind of very solo experience. And having the experience, which I did after, like, having practiced yoga for 20 years, of trying martial arts and trying more of like group practices where I was having to kind of go outside of myself. Like, that was really challenging for me. It challenged my comfort zone, but ultimately it's it sort of was, I felt, where the yoga took me. It
Mhm.
became more like it felt like I had been preparing to engage and to connect in this playful state, feeling safe enough in myself and my own awareness of my own body and space, that now I could go out and kind of test those edges a little bit. And I think that's another thing that I've really found uh, to be hugely life changing for me with yoga, is just the development of starting from a place of safety. Like, that's so important. It ties into the idea of play. Like, if you don't feel safe in your body and in yourself, you don't feel playful. The play, I think play in a way comes as a natural result of feeling safe in yourself. If you're in that kind of fight or flight and freeze state where you just feel locked up in your body, very hard to just, okay, let's just go play now.
Hmm. That's such a valid point. We were just at a conference a while back with Dr. Peter Levine, who's one of the main guys in trauma release and trauma
Yeah.
therapy.
Yeah.
And the cornerstone that they basically say for everything, for any healing to really begin, is it starts with safety. You can't
Hmm.
even turn on the part of the nervous system that allows you to heal until safety is a part of that. And
Yeah.
and like you said, when you feel safe, then you have the ability and the freedom to start to play. And when you are in a state of play, that's a non-judgmental place. And
Mhm.
as much as we don't like to judge, but it's like we judge ourselves so much in a yoga practice. You're looking, most people when they first start are looking around trying to figure out why they can't do it the way somebody else can. And if you
Mhm.
approach it with that playfulness, then it's fun, right? Which
Mhm.
allows you to stretch your boundaries and push your edge a little bit in a fun, playful way rather than a judgmental way, which generally
Totally.
I think just that in itself can be so transformative for your practice and the letting go that you were mentioning.
Yeah, just that shift in the mindset, and this, it's like letting go of judgment, starting with your own safety, like, not letting go of the expectations of what it should look like, because I firmly believe, like, I taught for many years trying to get everyone into the same shape. And after a while, it just becomes you realize it just, it doesn't necessarily capture the essence of what's beneath the superficial side of the practice of the shape, like, yeah, sure, you can make everyone look roughly the same, but are they really getting to that place where the internal changes are happening, where they're feeling more at home in themselves, they're feeling the desire to play, they're feeling the desire to be more creative? That's, to me, that's the potential of it, not looking like some picture perfect thing, because a lot of times behind that, what looks on the outside as this perfect shape, is this kind of like neurotic tendency to not feel okay, which is, I think there's enough of that already. This internal disturbance, it's just now transferring the way we're disturbed about other things in our lives into how we look in the shape of the pose. So
Hmm.
to me, it's so much not about that anymore. And it took me a long time to get to that point, because that's, how I learned to teach. And it's how, it's an easy place to go to, because you're creating these shapes and everyone's creating, and then you try to, you know just scale it, but it's not necessarily something you want to scale, because when it comes back to you after training like hundreds and hundreds of teachers, I realize you want to teach what we really, at essence, what we're trying to teach is we're trying to teach this sense of trust in our own process, and the sense of being at home in ourselves. And that's something that I think doesn't necessarily come from trying to create another shape.
Right. Well, and does that tie into your concept of deep rest a little bit? And I
Mm-hmm.
love your three B's, your movement, nutrition, and rest. And we can
Mm-hmm.
talk about that now too. But even when you're saying getting comfortable in your body, I would imagine an aspect of that requires you to experience deep rest to a point before you can even access that completely.
Yeah, so these three pillars are what are known as the three free therapies in traditional Chinese medicine. So, you know, when I see patients between sessions, I'm always giving people fun work or homework to do, which is, here's a movement that you can do that will support what's going on for them. Here's some dietary changes that you can consider, and here's a relaxation exercise that you might consider using. And these are profound ways to shift our state. I mean, in a way, rest, I felt, is the most underlooked of all three of these pillars. Most people are want to know what they can do, and want to know what more, what more can they do if they're on the path to of some healing process. They're on the path to greater health. They're motivated, and so they want to know, what can I do? I want to take supplements, and I realized, like, for me, over the years, the kind of critical keystone step is like learning how to rest. And it's such an overlooked thing. And we just have such a dysfunctional relationship with rest in our culture that it's still, I think, romanticized as this thing that people brag about when they look how much I did with so little sleep and so little rest. Is like, it's strange. We have a strange relationship, I think, that and there's no greater place where that dysfunction shows up than in mainstream medicine, like where interns and in rotation, they just go hours and hours without sleep. It's yeah, it's not, for me, it's not a healthy situation. So I think learning how to rest is an art, of course, because we've all experienced, like, it's not so easy when you're agitated just to like try to relax. It's
Hmm.
not often, doesn't really work. So it's a real art, like learning how to rest. And for me, um, rest starts with the concept of rest readiness, or what we might think of as like sleep readiness. So I'll often look at, like, because it's a cycle. It's, these three free therapies really are foundational in the sense that, these are the fundamental acts. We need to move in order to, in a way, seek nutrition. Like,
Hmm.
like with like our evolutionary bias towards movement was geared towards hunting and gathering, and we wouldn't survive without movement. And, you know, anyone who knows, if you go out and you move like ancestral humans used to move out in nature, you feel pretty tired at the end of the day. You feel sleep ready. So now, in this modern predicament that we find ourselves in, how can we recreate the ease, the fluidity of this cycle? To me, it's just by design. So rest starts with rest readiness. If you're someone who's sedentary, a practice as simple as shaking or moving, or just something, just getting the body to move, so that when you go to try to rest, you've shook the body to the point where rest is a natural consequence of that movement.
Yeah.
And so that kind of precipitated rest is the beginning. But then learning to kind of uh, connect with the body and use our minds through mindfulness to be able to dismantle patterns of tension, so that when we do sleep, our sleep is much deeper. I've been tracking my sleep through a sleep tech ring, and I've seen different patterns. And on the days that I do restorative yoga, that day my sleep is always deeper.
Hmm.
And so, there clearly, we're asking a lot of ourselves to just like hit the pillow and like snap our fingers and have this perfect, whatever, 8 hours of sleep. That we need to engage in practices that help us prepare and really go into deeper states of rest.
Yeah, such an important point. It's so true. A lot of times people are exhausted, but they can't sleep. That wired and tired sort of
Oh yeah,
sensation.
so common.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, question I've got for you too is, just being in this practice for so long, is where does the where do you find the practice of yoga plays out in our lives? So it's almost like where what's the saying? Where does the rubber meet the spiritual road, so to
Right.
speak? So it's
Yeah.
like, your 3-year-old screaming, or your teenager just told you to screw off, or the
Yeah.
person cut you off in traffic. For people that, you know, for people that are dealing with stuff, which a lot of people are dealing with this type of stuff, how do you find the practice you're doing on the mat? You can take it off the mat and incorporate into your life in a very real, practical way.
Yeah. Great question. Um, I think the first thing is through just learning to slow down. Like we slow down when we're deliberate enough to make a practice, whether it's, I only have 5 minutes or I have an hour to practice. Like I said, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And just the deliberateness of slowing down enough to make this practice something that serves you, I think that has the capacity to inform our lives, to change the way we relate to our spouses, or the way we relate to our kids, the way we interact with our colleagues. Like taking the time and really, I feel like there is a translational effect. Like when you slow down and you really take that moment to take a deeper breath and to notice yourself, then when you get to the office, you might be able to translate that and, notice the people around you and ask them how their day was, and, really take in that relational piece. So to me, there is sometimes difficulty in the translational part. So I think that can also be built into a practice. And I think that's a very necessary piece, that, you know, like the pursuit of happiness in a way can be one of the things that makes us unhappy, because inherent in that pursuit is the kind of judgment or the statement that I'm not okay as I am.
Mhm.
So I think that the way that we approach, ultimately the way we approach our practice, our yoga practice, is 100% going to inform our lives, and that, for better or worse, is what I mean. So like, if we are, just feeding our ego in our practice and just reinforcing more rigid beliefs, like to take an extreme example, then that might just reinforce how we see the world. But if we are able to take that time where our practice looks something like being receptive, being kind, being more gentle with ourselves,
Mhm.
learning to slow down when we feel reactive or reactivity arising, learning to approach our edges with compassion and a sense of love and playfulness, that I feel like that those qualities are what then translate into the kind of off the mat experience. So I think it just, all that to say, being more deliberate about the kinds of experience we want to have in our lives and in our relationships, and then actually practicing that on the mat is a really awesome way to actually start to design what a yoga practice could look like. If you're looking, you're not happy with the conflicts in your relationships, or you're feeling depressed in your work, or you're feeling like you lack creativity, like I think an amazing place, like it's literally a practice. It's a practice ground where we have this dedicated time to start to feel what we want to feel more of the time. And
Mhm.
I feel like it just grows, it just snowballs. If you practice playfulness and gentleness and generosity and a sense of ease when you're doing your yoga practice and your meditation practice, that's going to spill out into your life.
Yeah, beautiful. And yeah, it's like if you practice that enough, then that may eventually just become your default. Like
Totally.
that becomes what is your new normal almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
Scott, I want to be respectful of your time here too, but I have one more question I'd like to ask you, and it's a bit of a big one, and you can unpack it and think about it for a moment. But given the decades that you've been in this industry and all of the stuff that you've done, even as a parent and as a dad, as a husband, when you take in all of the stuff that you've learned and the influence that the teachings of yoga and the different traditions that you've gone through, what what has been the most influential? Has there been any specific teachings or practices or awarenesses or aha moments for you that really sort of shook things up and helped to kind of direct you or awaken to a little bit more of a even more meaningful life than what you are currently doing?
Yeah, that is a big question because I think there have been so many amazing aha moments. And, for me, the yoga practice really is about, sometimes you just have a practice. It's everyday kind of humdrum practice, but, in a way it's, looking for the wonder, looking for the awe in just the simplest thing, like in your breath, like being able to take a deep breath and just feeling how like how incredible it is that we are here, that just that kind of sacredness of it all and the amazing awe of it all, the wonder. And I think that probably that in and of itself is, I'm kind of answering your question with the most, like the most aha thing for me is to find the aha.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
to actually look for the aha, look for that thing that's going to inspire the jaw dropping. And it's there at every moment. It's just we're moving too fast, to actually be able to see it. And so I think, being able to slow down, and what these practices have taught me is that, we're so complex, and, science is an incredible thing. I consider myself a scientist of a different kind, and an observer and a researcher and a lifelong learner. And I'm super interested in the things that we don't yet understand, that we're just beginning to kind of touch on, that are so subtle, and this deeper realm that is there's just so much that we don't, the mysteries that we don't understand, and being open to that, although it can be uncomfortable at times, that being open to that and just realizing how incredible this experience is, that's what yoga's really taught me.
nice. I think that's wonderful. And it seems like that's one of the things that almost naturally arises if you've been in a practice and pursuing it, like you've talked about, over time. It's almost like you might just end up arriving there without having to look for it itself. It sort of springs up in those moments, probably of deep rest.
Maybe, as you said, it's like that becomes your default position, that if you practice slowing down and appreciating the incredible, like, experience that we're all having, just being alive, and you practice that enough, that becomes, you start to see it more and more, and it becomes your default position.
Yeah, well, I remember old mentor of mine, Dr. David Hawkins, and he would talk about the emotion that you are feeling is the lens that you see the entire world through. So it shades all of your perspectives. So if you're
So
generally
true.
feeling grateful, then the world becomes a very appreciative world. But if you
Hmm.
are in the lens of fear, then it becomes a really scary world. So that's within ourselves. And it sounds like from your perspective that the practice of yoga has really helped to kind of shift that state of consciousness so that it's easier to see the world through that lens.
Well said.
Yeah, wonderful. Scott, how can people learn more about you? Where can they find your information, learn about some of the wonderful retreats that you're holding, any
Hmm.
courses that you're doing, how they can see you in practice?
Yeah, so it's Scott Davis Holistic. So it's scottdavisholistic.com, and I'm on Instagram, it's Scott Davis Holistic, and on Facebook, Scott Davis Holistic. So just one thing. Holistic, Scott Davis Holistic.
Awesome. We'll put links in the show notes too, so that people know how to get a hold of you and check out all the work that you're doing. Scott, thanks so much for your wisdom. Thanks for sharing everything. Really wonderful. I think that's going to so much value for people. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Awesome.
Well,
That's a wrap.
that was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to invest in your health and well-being. Since this podcast is brand new, reviews and subscribers are so vital for us to get off the ground and share this really important information. So if you found this information valuable, please post a review and subscribe to the podcast so you'll get our newest episodes. Also, if you know of someone who would benefit from this, please share it with them. You can also find us on Instagram at #InspireHealthPodcast. If you have a question that you'd like to be addressed, direct message me on Instagram or leave a comment on one of my posts. I would love to hear from you. And you can grab our show notes and free resources for each episode at inspirehealthpodcast.com. So be sure to go online and check it out.